I think the studio's going to hate this with what you're giving me.
I think that's
to work.
good.
In 2017, Universal Studios announced the birth of a new shared universe of monster movies, bringing their classic horror icons into the contemporary franchise film landscape. But after the critical and financial failure of its first installment, the project was indefinitely abandoned. Now, in 2022, the powers that be have called upon one pulp horror devotee and one snarky film critic to unearth the concept. I'm Dylan Roth.
And I'm Dalton DeShane.
Are you afraid of the dark universe?
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of Are You Afraid of the Dark Universe? This is one half of your hosts, Dalton DeShane, here with...
This is the other half of your host, Dylan Roth.
And we are here to finally really kick off what this show is going to be. If you listen to our first episode, you heard us taking apart the first film in the Dark Universe saga, The Mummy, and sort of figuring out what went wrong and what we want to change. But now we are back. So for you, the listener, no time has passed. I mean, I guess you could have taken as much time as you wanted between those episodes, but
why would you want to? The first two are right there.
I'm sure you were so hooked by the ending of the first one, you came right to this one. But for us, it has been a month. And we went our separate ways and basically took the time to write our own pitches for the next films in the Dark Universe. We are going to start today with my pitch for Frankenstein.
I am so excited to hear this. We have not talked about our pitches during the last month. We want to save everything for the air. We know only a couple of details. We know like the time period and setting of each other's movies. And I know the studio mandated star because Dalton had one sort of, I don't know if you'd call it a positive or negative handicap for this on this project. You retain the casting that was announced for the Dark Universe's Frankenstein.
Which we actually got wrong in the last episode.
We did.
We should clarify,
we said we said that Javier Bardem was going to be playing the Wolfman. That's just me being stupid, and it's actually he had been cast to play Frankenstein's monster in a Bride of Frankenstein type movie. So that casting is the only guideline that Dalton had, whereas when I did my Wolfman, I had complete free reign, which kind of kicked ass. We'll get to that in the next episode. So I'm really excited to hear Dalton introduce us to our first real contribution to the Dark Universe, Dalton's Frankenstein.
Yes. What if I called it Dalton's Frankenstein instead of Mary Shelley's?
Who is Dalton DeShane's Frankenstein?
Yeah, just very presumptive right off the bat that like that's going to sell tickets. So this was a tough one because, we sort of talked about this last episode. Frankenstein is very imprinted on the cultural consciousness, but there haven't been many good Frankenstein movies. There's, of course, the original from 1931. Although I say the original, but the first ever Frankenstein adaptation was made in 1910 by Edison Studios. But the one we know is the 1931 Universal picture. And its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, which are arguably the definitive Frankenstein films.
Yeah, Bride of Frankenstein holds up incredibly well. It's considered like the original superior sequel. It's a lot of the imagery and ideas that people think of as being from the original Frankenstein, which was also James Whale. It is actually from Bride of Frankenstein.
Like those little tiny guys.
Yeah, I love those tiny guys, and we love Pretorius. But Dr. Pretorius. Yeah, there have been, we were going through like a list while we were eating dinner before this.
Young Frankenstein, of course.
That's a good one.
The other classic.
Almost all the other takes that people like are comedic riffs on James Whale's two Frankenstein movies from the 30s.
Which, those films are so different from the book. It's such a far cry from what's actually in Mary Shelley's actual Frankenstein novel. And so for my inspiration, I went to the novel. I know we'll talk more about this next episode, but I know you watched a lot of werewolf movies to prep for the Wolfman. I did not watch any Frankenstein movies. I didn't really want them floating around in my head. I wanted to go back to the source material, although I know there have been adaptations of just like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as well. But again, nothing has really stuck. Young Frankenstein, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. There's, of course, some recent big failures like I, Frankenstein and Victor Frankenstein. he was in Van Helsing. He's like appeared in other stuff with other monsters like Van Helsing or the Monster Squad.
And then you have, goofy things like the Munsters, which is just a parody, where you don't even use the name, right? But it's the imagery. I think the reason perhaps why all of these other okay, we're going back to basics. We're going back to the novel. People don't like it because to them that feels wrong, because what feels right is the universal Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a really interesting task of trying to make something that's based on the novel, but that will satisfy in a new and different way, and hopefully not be totally rejected by a society that just wants the exact movie that they saw on cable when they were a kid.
Exactly. There were a lot of things I wanted to accomplish with this. I did want to... first of all, I can't remember if we talked about this on the first episode or if it was off air, but we talked about how it seemed like a good idea to Spider-Man Homecoming this.
Right.
And I did not think that we have to watch Dr. Frankenstein create another monster again, or create the monster. That has been, we've seen the It's Alive moment. We've seen the electricity and everything.
So just like we don't need to see Uncle Ben die again.
Right. You don't have to do the Spider-Man origin story. We know how Spider-Man came to be. And so I didn't want to tell the origin story of Frankenstein's monster, but I also wanted to be closer to the original book. While at the same time marrying it with the Universal film and the things that we recognize from that, and also making it a modern horror movie. I think Frankenstein gets softened a lot because he is the empathetic monster. He is the, rejected by his creator. We sort of empathize with him, but that can sort of take away any sort of fear of him. So I wanted to make a modern horror film set in the time of the original novel that sort of combine those two. And in doing reading the original novel and also reading about Mary Shelley's life, I think I've also stumbled upon a take that also integrates sort of a metatextual story about Mary Shelley and her creating the book Frankenstein.
Okay. That sounds really exciting.
So that's where my mind was when I came up with this pitch. So these pitches are going to be detailed. I want to prep you for that. We're going scene by scene. In some cases, I have written dialogue. Now, this is first draft stuff. I don't want to be, a sensitive writer, but this is not my polished dialogue. This is very, functional. But yes, where there's going to be dialogue, we're going scene by scene, and then Dylan and I will talk and we'll sort of take it apart, see what works, what doesn't, and cast it. Here's the other thing. So we came up with cast lists. I don't want to share mine yet because I think there would be spoilers.
Oh yeah, we shouldn't do it while as characters are introduced.
Yes. So as I go into my pitch, the one that I will reveal is of course Javier Bardem as the monster, and the rest we will figure out as we go. I also am not as good as Dylan at doing things like casting and choosing directors and stuff. He is much more plugged into the industry. That is why he's our industry expert here, our resident critic, our Hollywood big shot. So he will help me with some of that stuff because in some cases, I've got a couple people settled, but other than that, we'll figure it out.
I'll be only too happy to help in that respect. And as I expect, you will likely be standing off a lot of the rougher edges of my story because I've never read or written a book.
Never. Do you know how to read a book?
Theoretically.
You've read like film synopses. You've read Wikipedia summaries of movies.
I recognize most of the words.
Okay, that's good. That's a good start. It's going to be hard when you write the treatment or when you read the treatment that you've written.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting if I put it in front of you, whether or not it looks like you're reading it like a cartoon and reading a dream where all the letters are jumbled. To me, it makes perfect sense. All right. Dalton,
let's do it. Okay.
Set the stage.
All right. Frankenstein. The year is 1831. The setting is Geneva, Switzerland.
Time to take a big drink of water and go to Geneva, Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. We open on a young man, 18 to 20 years old. He's working in a toy shop after hours, cleaning and putting things away. But what he's really working on is setting up a new display in the window. And it's a grand dollhouse. He's placing all of the dolls very carefully, creating a lovely little tableau of a family sitting around the dinner table. He gathers his things, he locks up the shop, and begins to run home through the deserted streets with a smile on his face. Suddenly, Javier Bardem, dressed in an upscale suit with a top hat and cravat around his neck, emerges from an alleyway, and the man collides with him and goes tumbling to the cobblestones. A variety of doll parts fall out of his purse and scatter on the street. My, Bardem says. And where are you off to in such a hurry this late at night, my young man? Home, of course, the man replies. My lady gets worried if the shop keeps me out too late. Ah, young love, Bardem sighs. It must be the most wonderful feeling in the world. Oh, is it ever? We're to be wed next spring. The anticipation turns my blood to electricity, I tell you. I'm sure at some point in your life you must have felt the same. Bardem gives a pained smile. In a way. Come, my carriage is parked nearby. I'll escort you the rest of the way. Bardem reaches out his hand and lifts the man to his feet. Oh, that's too kind, but it's really not necessary. I live just... The man trails off, looking at his hand. It's covered in a thick, bloody pus. My God. Sir, are you hurt? Bardem looks down at his palm. The stitching that runs across it is red and irritated and oozing pus. Indeed I am, my boy. This part pains me more than anything. He lunges at the man as we smash cut to Bardem working inside of his carriage. In a voiceover, we hear him say, It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld my man completed. For those looking for Frankenstein Easter eggs, that is the first line that Mary Shelley ever wrote of the book Frankenstein. We see him from the back, working on something unseen. His body is covered in stitching and seams, all of them infected, many of them oozing. His skin is a jaundiced yellow with tinges of green. We hear a fierce thunderstorm raging outside. Montage. We cut back to the empty street and see Bardem shoving the man's body in his carriage and slamming the door. It has started to lightly rain. Cut back to him working furiously in the carriage in the storm. Cut back to him brutally dragging the man's body on the ground by his ankle. He drops his body on the stoop of a house and pounds loudly on the door. Before anyone can answer, he walks away and hides in the nearby shadows. A woman answers the door, with an older man behind her. She sees the body of her lover and drops to her knees, desperately trying to wake him up. When he doesn't wake, she screams. We immediately cut back to the carriage workshop and see that Bardem has sculpted a crude, expressionistic statue of this moment, with the man's body on the ground and the tortured faces of his lover and father. He picks it up and roughly drops it on a table where we see dozens of other sculptures. We cut between them, lingering on one that shows the man carrying his lifeless daughter from the original 1931 Frankenstein film. As the monster walks to his bed in the corner, we see two holes in the side of his neck where the electrodes used to be. Like the rest of him, they're red and swollen and infected. He lays down in bed and we see the two electrodes in a dish on the table, caked in a green and red solidified muck. Title card, Frankenstein, Thunder and Lightning. Mwahaha.
Dope.
It's the opening scene.
That's fucking vivid.
All right.
Very intriguing. All right, I'm not going to interrupt you. Just keep
No,
going. I don't have any questions yet.
We cut to a young woman, Caroline Clerval, and her husband, Henry, riding into town in a carriage of their own. Now, this is going to be a kind of character setting, scene. We'll learn that Henry is a doctor who's moving to Geneva, and his wife, Caroline, serves as his nurse. Caroline's family has a home here that's been abandoned since her parents passed away, so that's where they're going to live. Caroline is she's very ladylike, very sort of petite, but very stern and serious. And we can see that the only person who can really get her to open up and laugh is her husband, Henry. We then get a scene of the monster going to visit another local doctor, Dr. Igor Waldman, who gives the monster medicines and ointments for his infections in exchange for being able to observe and take samples from his body. As Igor examines him, we get our first really detailed look at the monster. His entire body is infected, trying to reject the slapdash surgery that created him. He painfully peels his cravat off his neck, and his electrode wounds stick to it with strands of green gunk. Igor puts drops of a clear liquid on the worst parts, and we can see that the relief is so powerful that it almost moves the monster to tears. He's incredibly grateful for Igor and expresses how he is the only person he's encountered in his brief life to treat him with kindness. We then get a scene of Caroline and Henry visiting a patient in his home. The man's wife frantically explains that he was bitten by a spider that morning during breakfast. They look at the man's hand and see an enormous and gruesome swollen spider bite on the back of his hand. Henry snaps into action and has Caroline tie a tourniquet around his wrist. He explains to the man that they need to amputate his hand before the venom reaches his arm. The man and his wife both protest. The man is a smith, and without his hand, he'll lose his business and they'll have nothing. Henry explains that if they wait even one more minute, he might lose his entire arm. Their arguing intensifies until they hear a sudden thunk, and the man screams in agony. Henry and the wife look down to see that Caroline has already cut off the hand and is busy wrapping the stump in bandages. She looks up to see them staring at her and simply says, "You're welcome." Afterwards, Henry and Caroline walk down the busy streets of Geneva. Henry is chastising her for acting without the patient's consent, and also because she is a nurse and doesn't have the proper training to be amputating. That should be the doctor's job. He admits she did a good job, but that it could have been a disaster. Caroline apologizes and said she will not overstep her bounds again. A man runs up to Henry and says that a woman has fainted in the lobby of the inn and could he please come check on her. Henry sends Caroline on her way home and says he'll meet her there later. Walking home, Caroline comes across a crowd of people and hears a woman crying in anguish. She joins the crowd and peeks through and sees a little girl dead on the cobblestones, her mother crying over her corpse. Some policemen have arrived and are pushing the crowd back while a priest attends to the mother. Caroline looks around and sees the monster, standing head and shoulders taller than everyone else and staring intently at the mother and child. Caroline looks shocked by his appearance and studies his face before turning and hurrying down an alleyway. The monster turns and sees her fleeing and cocks his head and furrows his brow. He pushes his way through the crowd and follows her slowly. Caroline walks quickly down the alleys, taking the turns and trying to throw him off her trail. She is suddenly accosted by a tall man dressed in a black trench coat with a wide-brimmed black hat. "Excuse me, miss," he asks. "Do you know where I can find Dr. Frankenstein?" Caroline stops and looks behind her. The monster is gone. She looks back at the man. I'm sorry, who are you?" she asks. My apologies," he says. "My name is Cold. Indrid Cold." There's something off about this man. His skin looks slightly purplish, his eyes are too wide set, and the proportions of his limbs seem off. He wears boots with risers at the bottom and pants that are too short and show his ankles. Are you a priest?" Caroline asks. "If you say so," he responds. When she looks confused, he says, I'm sorry. I mean, it depends on your faith, whether you see me as a holy man or not, but yes, I am a priest." A priest from where? You don't look Swiss." "You are very perceptive, my lady. You're right, I am not. I'm from a faraway place called Prodigus. I'm new here in town, looking for a friend of mine by the name of Dr. Frankenstein. Have you seen him?" No, I'm sorry. I've never heard of him. I really must be going." She turns and Cold grabs her by the arm. "If you do meet him, please tell him I must see him at once. It really is urgent." She tears herself away, shocked, and storms off, while Indrid stares at her with a strange smile. Later that night, Caroline is preparing for bed. Henry is out attending to a patient, so she is home alone. She wanders through the silent house, and it's very dark and shadowy, and as a viewer, you know, like, some shit's probably about to go down, so we really kind of draw it out, you know. Finally, in the bedroom on the second floor, she goes to close the curtains, but before she does, she sees the monster standing on the street below, staring straight up at her. She freezes, staring back at him, before throwing the curtains closed and heading downstairs. She throws open the front door and looks at the monster on her stoop. "It is you," he says. "I saw you in town today. May I come in?" "Are you going to behave yourself this time?" she asks. He nods, looking a bit ashamed, and she lets him in. They sit down for tea in the living room. "I did not expect to see you ever return to Geneva," the monster says. "I thought the same of you," Caroline replies. "I am just passing through. I cannot stay anywhere for long. And you?" "My husband's work brought me back. I'm married now. He is a doctor of some renown, and I am his nurse." The monster laughs loudly. "A nurse? You know more of medical science than anyone alive. Why hold the tools for a man trying to save lives when you could be creating lives of your own?" "I've put that behind me. I've lost the taste for it after my first attempt was such a failure." The monster's smile fades and he scowls down at his tea. "Why are you here, creature?" she asks. I was hoping you might provide me a place to stay." Caroline cuts him off with laughter. He tries to continue. "I'm sleeping out of a carriage right now. Is that you that's been killing people every other night in town?" He is silent. Absolutely not. I expect you out of this town and out of my life for good at once. Still, you must reject me, Mother. Don't call me that. That is what you are. You created me. I am the person that you made. You are not a person at all. You are a thing, a hideous object molded by my hands, an abortion created in the service of science. You imbued me with life, and that makes me a human being as worthy of love and beauty as anyone else. Love and beauty are the spoils of all God's creatures, but God did not create you. I did. You may have life, but you do not have a soul. You are wrong, Mother. I do have a soul. I know it because it is rejecting this cursed body you stitched it into. Every second of every day I live in agonizing pain as this body tries its damnedest to die and destroy the soul that lies underneath. You speak of God and how his existence negates my own, but you have it backwards. The fact that you were able to create me is irrefutable proof that God does not exist, or if he does, he died long ago. Blasphemer, Caroline cries. I am the only creature on this earth who is returned from death's door. There is no God on the other side of it, only devils. At this moment, Henry comes home. He sees the monster and stands sputtering in the doorway. It's okay, Henry, Caroline says. He was just leaving. But that's... Come with me, I'll explain everything. Caroline hurries Henry upstairs and turns to the monster. When I come down, you will be gone, and we will never speak again. Understand? The monster glowers. Once Caroline leaves, he flips over the table with a roar. He gets up and pushes over boxes of their things until he notices a framed portrait come sliding out of one of them. He slowly walks over and picks it up. Cut to Caroline and Henry arguing. Henry is in shock. What is he doing here, Caroline? The monster looks at the picture. At the top, in script, it says, The Frankenstein Family. The portrait shows Caroline as a teen, her younger brother William, her mother, and her father, who looks exactly like the monster. Henry exclaims, You told me your father was dead! The monster looks at the portrait with building rage. He tears the painting out of the frame and shoves it in his pocket, throwing the door open and fleeing into the street with tears in his eyes. We see Indrid Cold watching this from the shadows. It's now late and the streets are empty yet again. A young boy of about 10 years old is riding his bike lazily towards the monster, who suddenly rushes at him. Whoa, watch out, mister! But the monster grabs him by the collar right off his bike with a grunt of, Come here! He drags the boy screaming down into a ditch where they're covered by shrubs and branches. Lights start to come on in the nearby houses. Down in the bushes, the monster wraps his hands around the boy's neck. He places his thumbs on the sides in the same spots where his own electrodes used to be, and plunges them deep into the boy's flesh, all the way up to his palms. With a final grunt of effort and rage, he twists his hands all the way around. From up on the street, we see the boy's head fly from the bushes and land on the cobblestones, followed by the body. We fade from this tableau into the monster's sculpture of it, with two parents grieving over the body. End of Act 1.
Yeah, damn, man. All right. There's a lot of questions that I don't want to ask because I imagine they're going to be answered for me as we go.
Of course.
And I'm not going to waste the audience's time with like my guesses about stuff. And I'm really just kind of enjoying and go. I know that as a podcast, I'm kind of not really doing my job right now because you've done yours very well. So I'm just going to take a nice little sip of this soda and let you continue on with the story. And I will reserve my feedback until at least the end of Act 2.
All right. Act 2. The monster goes to Igor's and pounds on the door, waking him up. He comes to the door and sees the monster covered in blood, tears on his face, and brings him in to wash up and give him his drops. As the monster begins to calm, he asks Igor what he knows of the Frankensteins. So here at this point, we're going to get some exposition by cutting between Igor and the monster and Caroline and Henry still talking at their house. Igor tells the monster that he doesn't know much, only that the Frankensteins owned a property in town that seemed to only be used by the mother and children as a vacation home. The mother, Elizabeth, was devoted to the children and took them with her everywhere. As the children got older, however, the young girl Caroline was suddenly nowhere to be found. The rumor around town was that their father, Victor, had sent her away in a fit of rage to live with her aunt. Igor never knew the truth, but something changed in Elizabeth then, and every time he saw her in town after that, she seemed despondent. Then about 5 years back, word got around that Elizabeth and Victor had died of scarlet fever, leaving Caroline and William orphans. In the conversation between Henry and Caroline, Caroline confesses that ever since she was a child, she was obsessed with the natural philosophy, aka science, her father practiced, much to Victor's dismay. He wanted her to be more ladylike, perhaps a poet or a writer, but Caroline couldn't have been less interested. To add fuel to the fire, she was not just interested in the works of modern natural philosophers, but in old alchemists like Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus, whose work was now the stuff of jokes among proper natural philosophers. At the age of 16, her father found her conducting experiments with his equipment and attempting to revive dead rats. He called her unladylike, a blasphemer, and threw her out of the house and forbade her to ever have contact with her mother or brother ever again. She was so consumed by grief that she actually did abandon her work, until her parents died in their home. She went to be with William and was so consumed with rage at her father that she decided to make him the subject of the experiment she had been working towards as a teen, with William as her reluctant assistant. Her first attempt was a failure, and the lightning ended up burning large swaths of tissue, forcing her to replace 60% of his body with parts from other corpses. On her second attempt, he came to life. But when she saw him moving around, sickly and unnatural, she was disgusted by him and demanded he leave. Enraged by her rejection, he turned violent and murdered William before fleeing into the night. She was left alone, without a family, and hoped she would never see the monster she made again. We then get some quiet moments of the monster in his carriage looking at the crinkled portrait. He traces his thumb along the edges of Elizabeth, his one-time wife, who I will say, in this case, is played by Angelina Jolie, who was rumored to be playing the bride in the Dark Universe.
Aha.
He looks at Victor and then looks at himself in his dirty and cracked mirror. The next night, Caroline comes home from the market and calls for Henry, who shakily announces that he's in the study. Caroline walks in to find the monster sitting in Henry's chair, with Henry on his lap, restrained by the monster's grip. "Sit down," the monster tells her. The monster throws the portrait on the floor. "You created me not in your own image, as your God did, but in the image of that which you most hated. Why? Let Henry go and I'll—" "Why?" he screams. "I don't know. I was angry, I was curious, I was compelled by my work to the brink of insanity. I was not myself. You created me with the intention of abandoning me from the start. You hated me before I breathed a single breath. You gave me life with the sole purpose of rejecting my humanity as yours was rejected. Who knows, perhaps your God even did the same with all of you." Caroline is silent. "It is clear to me what must be done." The monster explains that before his body died, it was not a lone soul, but instead one half of a loving whole. When he was resurrected resurrected without that missing half, without that love. Since then, he has known only hatred and rejection, and so that's all he can feel about himself. He only knows how to hate himself and everyone around him, but once he is complete, he will for the first time gain the thing every other human feels but him: love. With this missing part of him restored, he will no longer have any desire to hurt any human ever again. "You preserved your mother's body as you did your father's, correct?" "What? No, of course not. Do not lie to me," the monster screams and squeezes Henry until he cries out. "Knowing what you know about life after death, you would never condemn your mother to rot in a grave. I would imagine she is being held at your family's castle in the mountains of Jura, where I was born. You will take me there, and you will build my missing half. I would sooner die, foul creature." The monster lifts up Henry's arm, gripping it in the middle of the forearm. He squeezes, and Henry cries out in agony, until finally something snaps and his arm breaks askew. The monster stands and throws Henry to the floor. "I will give you 1 week to change your mind." The monster leaves. In the coming days, Caroline and Henry continue to work. Henry's arm is in a sling, which leaves Caroline to do most of the physical work. Now that her secret's out, she does it with gusto, and it's clear that she's a better doctor than Henry, which causes some friction between them. Caroline also expresses to Henry that she's adamant she will not work for the monster. One day, Caroline is accosted in the street again by Indrid Cold, who calls her Dr. Frankenstein, and expresses surprise that the man he's been looking for is a woman. She corrects him and says her name is Clerval, and that she is not a doctor. Indrid Cold reveals that he knows about the monster's bargain, and says that she must not make him a mate. He warns her of the evil inside him, and stresses that she cannot introduce another being like him into the world. He brings up her love of her mother, and asks if she could bear to see her form mutilated in such a manner, and wedded to such a beast. Caroline looks haunted by the thought. Meanwhile, the monster has begun following a prostitute at night, one who resembles Elizabeth. He approaches her in the dark one night and asks her for a drink. They go to a dimly lit tavern and talk, and she flirts with him and compliments him. It's clear that this has never happened to him before, and the cold-hearted monster we've seen melts. He practically weeps in gratitude at this woman treating him not just as another person, but as someone desirable. They go to the local inn and rent a room. The woman tries to turn the lights on, but he keeps them off. They begin to undress, but as soon as the woman's hands run down his neck and chest, they get covered in his excretions. She panics and turns the lights on and beholds the monster with all of his stitching, his oozing sores, and his yellowy eyes, and she screams. He leaps over the bed and clamps his hand over her mouth, and we see his expression turn sour as his eyes lose all life. Cut to the next morning. Henry finds a large package on their front stoop addressed to Caroline. They open it together and find the woman's leg hastily torn off her body. A note says, "The longer you wait, the more components I will gather." That night, Caroline comes to the monster's carriage, parked off a dirt road in the woods. He opens and lets her in, and she sees his collection of sculptures. My God, are these all... Her eyes land on one that doesn't look like the others. It's the beginning of a sculpture of Elizabeth. Why? She asks him. Why do you kill such innocent souls and cloud this world with more misery? Why are you evil? I am not evil. I do not kill out of hate. I have nothing in my heart but gratitude for these people. They've helped me see what I've been missing. My whole life I've known only rejection. The idea of being loved by another is entirely foreign to me. So I've sought out that feeling, to see it when it's at its most potent, in the moment when the object of one's love is ripped away from them. That is when you can see their love in all of its colors at once. I create these sculptures to convince myself that someday someone could want so desperately to keep even me. Caroline is quiet for a moment, then says, You named me after your mother. I did no such thing. You did. You loved her very much. How crushing it must have been to know you wasted the name on a disappointment such as me. Perhaps this is the curse of all families. As children, we know nothing but love for our elders, only to grow up and see that love perverted by our parents and children alike. I was never a child. In my life, I have known only perversion. Caroline pauses to think, then says, I will build you your bride, and then you will leave with her and never contact me or anyone I know again. Do you swear it? I do. And Henry will stay here. I don't want him anywhere near this depravity. I have an assistant already chosen for you. We leave tomorrow. End of Act 2.
I don't know about you, but I am definitely seeing this in a very, and sort of like a heavily stylized visual sort of motif. I want to hear from you, like, how do you, before we can go on, because I've kind of developed a picture of it in my head, and I'm curious about what this movie looks like to you.
That's a good question. I guess I've just sort of been picturing it as sort of a dark period piece. I think stylization is always helpful. I guess I've been sort of picturing the sort of grounded imagery of like Blumhouse's recent Invisible Man, but as a period piece, something very dark and shadowy, but grounded. The dialogue, of course, is very heightened, especially the way I'm performing it.
Yeah, I think that's part of what's giving me the impression that I'm kind of, when you started into your initial monologue, or rather initial introduction of the cold open, it probably had something to do with the voice you're doing with the kid and everything. I kind of did put it in sort of like a black and white or low chroma sort of color palette.
I think that would be fun.
And like sort of an interesting sort of, I can tell you, I'm very interested in the way that you have created what feels like an original story to build around this character that also kind of incorporates elements of the novel. I like the idea of Caroline as sort of being, like you said, like sort of a Shelley analog, and the way that you're playing with the relationship of the creature as both the creation and the creator of Dr. Frankenstein in this case. I think that's really interesting. I think the studio is going to hate this. I know we're still going, so I am so glad. This is going to be such an interesting podcast because you have gone so directly into the idea of, yes, we are doing the modern equivalent of classic horror movies, and I have made exactly the kind of schlock that I make fun of. We're going to get to that.
You made like a studio.
I very much did, yes.
And this is absolutely like this is a low to mid budget, like straight up horror take on Frankenstein. And I do think, I should get through Act 3, but I do think probably the violence.
I'm excited to hear it. I'm listening to it and I'm thinking, like, obviously the main thing that I am is thinking about, like, this is very interesting. I think I can very easily see many of these scenes, and I get the sort of very, very I think this is a very interesting, this is like a prestige film. This is the kind of thing, especially with like a star like Javier Bardem. This is the kind of horror movie that would get like awards attention. I can imagine putting like a very deliberate visual stylist behind the helm of this movie. And then I get distracted thinking about how what I have to pitch to you in the next episode does not sit even remotely anywhere like it belongs with what you're giving me.
I think that's good. We'll talk about it more when we finish.
I'll let you finish Act 3.
I think that's good.
I don't want to distract us much farther, but
I love that we are pitching like opposite things right now.
Yes, and I think it's going to be funny, especially hopefully people listen to this, and I think there will be people who are like, oh, I listened to it for the Dalton episodes, or I listened to it for the Dylan episodes, and there might be a lot of people who just like have no interest in one or the other of us at all. Okay, all right. That's a long enough digression. Let us please continue. And let's
the thrilling conclusion of Dalton Deshane's Frankenstein.
Mm-hmm.
And so the monster, Igor, and Caroline set off to the big Frankenstein castle in the Alps. It's built just like the one in the 1931 movie. And in this section, we're going to see them start to make the body. Elizabeth's body parts are all chopped up and contained in jars full of preservatives. She did save her mother's body. We see the monster continuing to work on his sculpture of her, which is far less expressionistic than his others and more just like a classical, beautiful portrait. The monster lives in the rickety wooden servants' quarters behind the castle while Igor and Caroline work inside. They stitch Elizabeth's body together bit by bit, and Igor develops a fluid for her blood that he says will keep her from becoming infected like the monster. Then one day, they're all present for the attachment of the head. Igor carefully removes it from the jar and places it on the slab before turning things over to Caroline for the stitching. Caroline looks into her mother's eyes and shakes her head, whispering, I can't do this, and backing out of the room. The monster follows her furious. He reminds her of her promise. Caroline vomits onto the stairwell and stumbles, clutching her stomach. The monster notices this and sees the outline of it through her work apron. You're pregnant, he says. She confesses that she is, that she and Henry found out just before she left. The monster corners her against a wall and whispers, You have seen firsthand what I do to children. The only way that child of yours will ever be safe is if you placate my rage by delivering me my bride. If you refuse, I will rip your child out of you with my bare hands. Because if I do not get to know love, then neither will you. They attach the head and wait for the next big thunderstorm to bring the creation to life. When the time comes, of course, it's like a big set piece. We've got all hands on deck. It's what I said I didn't want to include in the movie. It's just like the big, lightning, electrifying thing, but a little different.
The stakes are different. I like the way that it's a different context for the familiar imagery.
Exactly. It's still a Frankenstein movie.
Yeah.
Caroline says they'll need 3 strikes of lightning to animate the body. The first arrives and the bride's muscles spasm. She starts to move and stretch her limbs, and a groan escapes her throat. The monster rushes to her side and looks down at her, talking to her sweetly and begging her to come to life. The second strike hits and her eyes open. The monster cries out in happiness and watches in wonder as the bride sits up on the slab. The monster climbs up on the slab with her and stares into her eyes. She seems to see him, and she reaches up a hand toward him. The monster weeps and raises his own hand. When they touch, a spark travels between them and electrifies the monster's body. He stares at his bride in wonder. Meanwhile, Caroline is watching in horror. She sees the body of her mother on that platform and sees a desecration of her memory. Igor tells everyone to prepare for the third strike, but Caroline throws him aside and throws the switch off just as the lightning hits, which fries all of the machinery in the lab. The bride falls back on the slab, lifeless. The monster screams at Caroline, "What have you done?" He begs her to turn the machine on, but Igor tells him they can't, it's burnt out. The monster holds his bride in his arms and weeps, stroking her hair and begging her to come back to him. "I can't do this alone," he cries. "Not anymore. I can't do this anymore, my love. I need you. Please come back to me." Caroline backs towards the exit. "I'll kill you!" the monster screams and goes after her. Igor tries to stand in his way, but the monster immediately snaps his neck and tosses him aside. What happens next is our Michael Myers and Jamie Lee slasher sequence through the castle. The monster is stalking her through the hallways, up the stairs. She hides, he finds her, she flees. At one point, he manages to grab her sleeve, but she fights back by grabbing his arm and yanking as hard as she can, which rips his forearm stitches and sends his lower arm sliding down the bone, rendering his hand useless. Eventually, their chase leads to the servants' quarters behind the castle. Caroline grabs a piece of wood and sticks it in the fireplace, then brandishes the burning log at the monster. He backs away, but then knocks it to the ground where it sets the cabin ablaze. He knocks Caroline back and she hits her head and falls to the floor unconscious. The monster grabs the burning log and holds it over his head, ready to strike her open and vulnerable stomach. But he can't do it. The spark from Elizabeth has introduced love into his heart, and he can no longer kill. He bursts into tears and falls to the floor, crying over her body while the fire rages. We cut to him carrying her out of the burning building, again similar to the old man carrying his dead daughter in the original film. He lies her on the grass and then flees into the woods. Inside the cabin, his sculptures melt in the fire. We linger for a moment on the statue of Elizabeth. The year is 2022. Jenny Halsey, played by Annabelle Wallis, arrives in the North Pole. Her team on the ground there informs her that 6 months ago, a massive ice shelf melted into the sea. Shortly afterwards, several Russian ships reported seeing a man wandering on the ice. She ventures out, but the team gets caught in a blizzard and she's separated from them. She wanders in the White House until she's suddenly grabbed from behind by the monster. But instead of attacking her, he grabs her and carries her into a hovel he's carved out in the ice, with a fire burning. He offers her some seal meat while she warms up. "What year is it?" he asks. 2022, she responds. He sits with that knowledge in silence, then says, "I meant to sleep here forever. It seems I got close." Jenny asks, "Who are you?" He looks into the fire with hollow eyes and says, "You may call me Victor Frankenstein." The end. The doctor is a woman and the monster is Frankenstein. In our dark universe, the monster is Frankenstein.
It's, all right, so out of curiosity, did you begin with the idea of, oh, we're going to cut the Gordian knot on this whole, is the monster Frankenstein?
I didn't begin there, but I was very happy when I stumbled about it. Basically, where I started was reading about Mary Shelley and how her father actually did kick her out of the house and reject her. Mm-hmm. And she put a lot of that into the Frankenstein book with the creator rejecting his creation. And I sort of thought, well, that's actually something interesting to play with. And especially, I think in our horror climate right now, we deal a lot with generational trauma and things getting passed down. Mm-hmm. And I've sort of turned that into an Ouroboros of generational trauma where Victor Frankenstein passes it to her. She passes it back to him as the monster, and then he passes it to other families through his sculptures.
I think it's really interesting as an interesting twist on the nature of the creature himself, that he both is and isn't Victor Frankenstein.
Yes.
Right? That there's, rather than starting with the idea of being a blank slate or a new person, that it's sort of both.
Which is also from the novel. The novel plays a lot with people, the duality of people, and how like a lot of the characters in the novel are actually different aspects of Victor Frankenstein himself. Mm-hmm. And this just sort of turns that subtext into text by being like, well, they are the same person and different people, literally.
It has been, I guess, about 12 years since I read the book. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wish that I had reread it, but in preparation for this. But it is... first of all, I really like the way that you have made this into, it's a drama first and foremost, right? It feels like it's a very emotional family story. It's eerie. We have our pops of blood, right? I can't stop seeing it as a probably, you mentioned like a contemporary thriller vibe to it. But in a period piece.
Contemporary horror.
And I can't, in my head, I'm just not seeing it that way. The lazy part of my brain that's not trying very hard to pick, because you didn't name a director for this.
No.
But you said you told me off the air that you did have an idea of who you might want it to be.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to hear what that thought was.
So, well, first of all, also, because with the summary here, I do want... There are several kind of key horror sequences here that I would really want to land. Mm-hmm. My whole thing, one of my philosophies of horror is that one of the more effective strategies you can use in scaring an audience is opening with your big scare, which shows the audience that sort of anything is possible. And then you don't have to reach that height again. And for example, the opening scene of Scream. Super terrifying and very graphic.
Very graphic, and it never gets that graphic
It never gets that graphic again.
But you always think it might happen.
You think it could happen because of that opening scene. Another example is the little boy being killed at the beginning of Jaws, which I have put that scene in here. The little boy at the end of Act 1 who gets fucking wrecked by Frankenstein. And the thing is, I want those moments to be very intense and very scary. And I think the brutality of the monster in that moment, who is so, in a rage at finding out that he is his creator's father, just charges at this boy, throws him in the ditch, and rips his head off. The 10-year-old boy. That is intense. And I think my hope is that because of that, it never needs to get that graphic again. But we still get, the other thing is
the character at this point is terrifying.
Right. And I gloss over like the Michael Myers hunt at the end, but I would want that to be very intense. I want the fear to come from you knowing what the monster is capable of and knowing that he is only capable of extremes of emotion, extreme sadness, extreme happiness, and extreme rage. And in the moments where he is softened by Igor's treatment of him or the prostitute's treatment of him, we see how deeply he feels any kindness. But that when that is gone, he will fuck you up. And that is like the fear of him flipping that switch is what makes, and also the contemporary body horror, the stitching, the goopy, the oozing, that kind of stuff. But mostly just like the opening sequence, the sequence with the boy, the sequence with the prostitute, seeing like how brutal he can be carries the horror element of it, which then allows us to have these extremely tense family moments where the tension is brought on where you're not exactly sure how Frankenstein is going to react. That is my hope.
I think
don't
it's
know
also
if it comes across.
No, I think it does very much. And I think that I don't know how much this came to mind when you were working on it, but the fact that you had kind of inherited an actor for this role, I could very easily see Javier Bardem really killing this and being able to bring both the stillness and the intensity required in all of these different situations.
I think he's perfect casting. I really lucked out with Javier Bardem being locked in. I also really like that we have Angelina Jolie in the movie and she never says a word.
She's going to ask for a lot of money, but that's not our department.
But the director.
Yes, I'm really curious who you have in mind because I have something in my head that I think what I have in my head I think is a really lazy choice, but it is what sprung to mind immediately, and I'm wondering if we're anywhere near the same wavelength.
If I'm going to guess that your choice is better than mine, because like I said, this is not my strong suit. I don't think this is a perfect choice, but for some reason, the person that came to my head was Andy Muschietti, who did the It movies as well as Mama, and is currently doing The Flash.
So looking for work.
Yeah. But he's done big budget. He is responsible for, that's the other thing is like the studio is going to hate this, but if we get a director who made the highest grossing horror film of all time, which is a pretty low scale, the first It movie is not, enormous in scale. It's the story of some kids being terrorized by this monster.
Right.
And I think
it's very effective. And there are some really interesting, like that was chilling for me in theaters. I wasn't watching it with like an intense critical lens at the time, but I actually never watched chapter 2.
It's not good.
Yeah, that's why I didn't.
But the first one, I think what drew me to him is he's so good at doing the character moments. Like I felt like all of the drama in it, chapter 1 at least, was very well executed and then punctuated by these moments of extreme horror that then linger throughout and make it commercial and scary. So that was I don't know if that's exactly the right choice.
No, I think that's an interesting choice, and it would never have occurred to me. There are 2 names that came to mind, and I'm sure they're both names that are going to come up again during the length of this project. Because I was trying to think about, when I was trying to think in my head as somebody who I think of as being of having made one of the best of their generations, like psychological and supernatural horror, like family drama thing. I'm thinking about Jennifer Kent, who did The Babadook, but I haven't seen any of her other work, and there hasn't been a lot of it.
Yeah.
So that came to mind, and then the fucking lazy ass answer I have is just like, this is so incredibly up Guillermo del Toro's street.
Oh, I mean, that's like, that should be my dream
in
pick.
In my head,
is a Del Toro.
I mean, we're like, it's Universal is putting together the budget for this, right? They have endless deep pockets, and that will definitely put asses in seats.
Yeah.
Trouble being that he's kind of made this movie already a couple of times.
Yeah.
Like, he loves to do stories about otherness, outsiderdom. He likes to do that, especially when it's kind of built up with sort of interesting family dynamics. And
there might not be enough
self-loathing
elements.
He's also going to rewrite your entire script.
Yeah.
And like if we were to, to tell him, oh, we want Guillermo del Toro to do Frankenstein, they'd be like, yeah, of course we do too. But he keeps coming in with these batshit crazy ideas. He's not going to use anything that we want, right? So I'm cool with keeping Machete because I think that for one thing, I think that's somebody who will execute your vision of the movie.
Yeah.
Right. And we are in the Feige seat here. We're not. We're coming up with the entire stories in movies. We're not necessarily looking for an auteur, right?
And the It movies were very faithful to the novel, and so he might be faithful to the script as well,
And I like the idea of it being the kind of thing where, like, and that actually the first one is actually period horror, and it doesn't feel overwhelmingly like cute about its time period either. And we don't want this to be either, right? Because you're looking for something that feels grounded and sincere. It is a contemporary horror film set in a time period. No, I like it. I like the pick. And I'm curious about the other casting you're talking about.
Sure.
I don't think I have any big story notes. And it's easy because it's so separated in time from the things we're doing in the larger universe. I don't think there's anything that needs to be micromanaged on a continuity level. And this seems like so much well thought out as your baby that I don't have any I don't really have any but what ifs.
Here's my sell to the studio. Because as you're saying, this is not a big franchise thing.
Yes, that's one of the reasons why I feel like I don't have a lot of notes, and that my whole thing would be kind of thinking about like, okay, well, how we make it fit into X, Y. Like, I kind of don't want to mess with it, right? I don't have your pitch in front of me to do like line item notes about like questions about intent here or there. I feel like you have kind of very clear thematic ideas. I think that because of the nature of you writing it out as a thing that you have to read and deliver certain things through dialogue, obviously, I think the film would be more subtle. Be able to do a lot more visually.
Yeah, I'm having to just very spell out some themes in the dialogue here that would not just be so blunt.
And of course, if we were to watch the movie that you just did, it would be just like my pitch would be. It'd probably be about 45 minutes, and we're looking for something probably more like one like 90 to 110, right? Because we want to keep these from being too long.
Yeah.
Horror movies should be that long. Yeah. So I guess really all there is more to talk about this is the shit that like the sort of podcast universe building level stuff of let's talk about the cast. Let's talk about the choices about you, as you warned you might in the last episode, you have integrated some Mothman shit. I think in terms of creating that as the origin of the Protogeum.
But I tried to, okay, so let me get into a couple things here. We got to talk about the cast. I will talk about the universe stuff, but I also want my pitch to the studio as for why this should be the first movie in our Return to the Dark Universe is, first of all, public faith in the Dark Universe is cratered. That is why we are doing this, because The Mummy was so bad that the entire project was canceled. I think what we need to rebuild the trust is the award winner kind of movie, is an auteur kind of film, and one that you don't have to spend a lot of money on. This doesn't have to be a $100 million picture. But you make it smaller scale. You get the horror fans back on board. You get the critics back on board with a self-contained quality story that isn't loaded down with universe building stuff, and allows people to reconsider what they thought the Dark Universe could be. Because here's the thing. We're going to get into the franchise stuff. We have to. This stuff is all going to have to start connecting.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're going to be doing that pretty immediately in the next episode.
Exactly. We're going to be building to our Avengers. So while we're here at the beginning, and we have such low public confidence in the Dark Universe, give them a little critical treat. Give them a little small scale thing that tells people, hey, we can do this. We can do justice to these characters. And then we start getting crazy with it. And the budgets start getting bigger.
Oh, listen, philosophically, I'm completely with you. And again, we're not going to be getting feedback from Universal until we're done.
Right.
So
and we'll be able to
sell them what we
have,
and they can throw out what they want, right? But the idea that to sell the idea right from the beginning that the biggest complaint about the Marvel Universe and that it's all very samey and very cookie cutter, we're not doing that. These films will be the individual films with individual tones appropriate to what we're trying to say, to the legacy of the characters that we're trying to exploit. And I like that. And I like the idea that they don't all have to fit into the same box. I think that makes it a much more interesting tapestry. I have no idea if they will agree.
Well,
but we don't have to worry about it.
Not yet. Once we finish all of the films, if we have to go back and tweak this one, that'll be okay.
And we'll take the money and run.
But as far as the cast goes, so obviously we've got Javier Bardem as the monster. We have Angelina Jolie as the bride. For Caroline, I was initially thinking Thomasin McKenzie.
Oh, I like her.
I think she might be too young, though.
I was imagining someone in her late 30s.
I have since switched to Alicia Vikander.
Okay.
As someone who I think can sell like the idea that she would be seen as just like another lady of society in Geneva, but also be very stern. Like I picture Caroline as being like kind of having like sort of a probably on the spectrum kind of bent where like she is very intense and focused. And Henry kind of is the only one that can break her out of that. But that's kind of what allows her to hyper focus and create something like this. And then also so steadfastly reject him is like sort of having that sort of trait to her. And I think Alicia, I think it's Alicia.
I don't think I've never heard her say it.
I think she would do a good job. For Henry Clerval, her husband, I had Liam Hemsworth, one of the lesser Hemsworths.
Sure. No, I know him from like Westworld and shit.
That's actually Luke Hemsworth.
Never mind.
Yeah, Liam is the sort of in between the two of them.
I can't even place his face in my head.
Really, I think you just need like a generic handsome guy.
Sure,
like
it's not a meaty role. You just need someone who you'll want to not see die.
Yeah, he's the damsel in distress that you know kind of gets
no opinion.
ass handed to him. For Igor, my boy David Dasmalchian.
Yes!
I gotta get my boy
Tailor-made
David
for that.
Dasmalchian.
Absolutely.
As Igor. The role
The
David
modern day
Dasmalchian.
Richard O'Brien.
Yes, he was born to play Igor. Now, so the only character, like main character I think I don't have is Indrid. So that was one I actually thought maybe David Dasmalchian for him, but I think he fits Igor better. I don't know. We might have to figure out an Indrid. I don't know if we have to do that now or if we want to do that.
I think when we introduce a character, we should give ourselves the challenge of having to cast that role now.
Okay.
And stick with it.
So
So we're
who's our
looking for somebody with an
otherworldly-
otherworldly quality.
Yes.
Kind
Kind of alien.
Okay.
Someone unsettling to look at.
Well, whenever you say someone unsettling to think that in movies, for one thing, we kind of have a problem right now in Hollywood where everyone's too pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And the one exception I always pick to this is Matt Smith. He's the weirdest looking guy in the world to me.
Yeah.
But I feel like now everyone's a little bit too familiar with Matt Smith, and he will not seem alien enough, especially now that we were recording this the day after they relaunched a new Game of Thrones show.
Yeah, he's in that. Yeah.
There was a period of time where he wasn't in a lot, or at least not in a lot that anybody would care to watch.
Mhm.
And so he kind of still retained that sort of weirdness.
Yeah.
I feel like people have decided he's handsome.
I-
Granted, a lot of people had a crush on the 11th Doctor, so but trying to think, it's just there's kind of a drought of weird looking guys because even our character actors are leading men faces now.
Yeah. I was almost thinking, when I was picturing his voice, I was picturing Benedict Cumberbatch's American accent, where like he's like trying to talk normal, but it's very strangely articulated.
I mean, like I was imagining, because the thing that came to mind, I immediately started thinking about like Dark City, and that is Richard O'Brien.
Mhm.
He's too old, and I'm kind of trying to imagine. I like the idea of maybe casting a British actor to do a very affected American accent.
Yeah.
But maybe we don't want to like say, oh, who do we know who does a bad American accent?
Yeah. They can put on a bad American accent.
Okay, and you're kind of set on the gender of the character, and I mean, finding a weirder looking female actor is even harder. But
I think I'm not, tied to the gender. I think just given the way the character is written now as sort of a character of like sort of authority in 1831,
they were probably looking at a white dude.
we're probably looking at a white guy just for the time period, but I am not opposed to going outside of that.
Okay.
This is a very white film, unfortunately.
I mean, it has a little bit to do with the period and the setting,
Yeah.
but it's always something that we can mix up as we go.
All of our other ones will be modern, and I
have a lot more diversity in my cast of my movie. Just being set in 2022 California. I am trying to think of another like sort of like in that between placeable ages time. That's the other thing about Matt Smith is in that period of time where like he's in that he looks like he could be any age.
Yeah.
Which I think is useful. I don't know that I'm going to come up with something better than Matt Smith, but it's also just like a lot of things with casting. It's like he was in a thing I just watched, so therefore he's going to pop up into my head. Now, the other question is, are these actors you're comfortable with throwing out? Like,
what about wait?
Yeah,
Cillian Murphy.
Cillian Murphy is a great looking, weird looking guy.
And here's the thing, he's a very high profile. But if we keep him, my vision for Indrid Cold is that he's sort of ageless.
Mm-hmm.
And we can keep Cillian Murphy and keep him as a key part of Prodigium throughout the series and sort of give him an elevated look.
I would much rather see Cillian Murphy in this role than Matt Smith.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's good. Now, the thing is just with Cillian Murphy being an actor who could be so useful in so many different weirdo roles throughout this franchise. So to put him in one where we can drop him into practically any movie, that seems like a good use of the guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to have to kidnap him out from Christopher Nolan's house or whatever.
Which brings us to, I think, the final thing we want to talk about, which is the universe tie-ins. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they're pretty light. There's the ending where the woman from The Mummy finds him. We have our Captain America thawing out moment. And Frankenstein is brought into the modern day. There's also him talking about how he has been to death's door.
Mm-hmm.
Because
I noted the phrase. I listened back to the podcast and I realized it's something we actually came up with between shows, which we try not to do.
Oh, really?
The idea of, you mentioned the death is but a door being a theme you wanted to go through. And specifically the words death door is something that we'd mentioned that I guess I will just save as being like sort of our arc words.
Yes.
So I noticed that there. So I guess if there's any information that you have backstory you've created about Protogium, that it would be relevant to me trying to develop future stories that I should know that's not contained in the pitch you just gave me.
I actually wanted to keep it deliberately very vague so that we have a lot of material to work with. This was me. I want to, as we talked about last episode, just kind of tear down what Prodigium was in the first film and build something more interesting.
Yeah.
And this was just me starting to do that by showing it as clearly something that has existed in some form for several hundred years. He doesn't identify it as Prodigium. He says he is from Prodigus.
Yes.
Which in my head is another planet.
Naturally.
But we don't have to be tied to that.
Sure. And a person in 18, whatever year it is, not going to hear that and think immediately, oh, he's talking about another planet. Because
right.
That's not really within their cultural context.
In my original thing, he was going to say he's from a place in America called Prodigus, because that's like a foreign land, like I'm from America, Prodigus. But I deliberately left it very vague. I think we have this Indrid Cold character that I think we can bring back, and I think will be interesting. We put him in a modern setting. You're like, oh, that's the same guy, and he's the same age. Like, what's going on here? I want to actually tease out the mystery of Prodigium. I want to turn it mysterious. And so I don't want to be like, this is exactly what it is right now. I want to find that as we find ways to make it interesting to the viewer and let the viewer guess as to what exactly is going on with this. And that, oh, there's more to this organization than met the eye in The Mummy.
All right. I have to warn you that I have so far in a minor role kind of used the more conventional version of Protogium in my pitch.
Okay.
I don't think there's a reason for me to, I don't think I have to ask for any changes here.
Cool.
In order to make them fold in and fit together.
That is the thing, since we're writing these movies at the same time, we might run into parts, especially as we get more into the deep lore stuff, where our two movies that we're recording the same day have conflicting lore in them. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have to learn how to reconcile that.
I am also interested to see, because we are, of course, this is the first time that we're pitching at each other, right? Mm-hmm. We do write very differently, and we have similar interests and somewhat different sensibilities as well. And so I wonder if it's the kind of thing where I wonder to what degree we're going to end up directly workshopping each other's stories. Or it could just be that I don't really have anything that I feel like editing out of your work, and then we're going to go in next one, and you're going to have a big checklist of notes for me, which will be very interesting.
I think at this point, since we're at the beginning, I think a lot of that will come when we're really into all of the movies being more interconnected and more like a web. And your movies are feeding off of mine and mine are feeding off of yours.
Right.
And that's when more of the notes are going to happen. Like, ooh, you did this thing with Frankenstein in your movie that I think might actually play better based on this, what I
Right.
have
And I
conceived for him in this way.
I think that should be a lot of the fun of this. I think this part of what's going to make it interesting is that we're going to have to kind of make a goulash out of our different sort of writing aesthetics and interests. I think we're going to touch on some similar themes, just on a kind of having pretty similar politics. But it's interesting to me to think also, I'm sitting here in the capacity, each of us, when we're not the one pitching, we're being pitched to, is sitting here in the capacity of being a producer. And my job as a producer is not actually to respect your authorial intent. But also, they're not sitting over my shoulder right now. I like you as a storyteller, and I want you to be able to tell your story. And what I like about the story that you've told is, while I understand that it's a synthesis of Shelley and of a couple of cinematic influences, including 2017's The Mummy, it has the feel of a personal work. And that's something that's totally absent in blockbuster filmmaking for the most part right now, unless you're like Jordan Peele. Certainly it's missing from Marvel most of the time. These movies don't feel personal. They don't feel intimate at all. This story, as you told it, feels like a story that matters to you. And even if it's just, this is the tone that you're delivering it in, even if it's just me being a sap, it feels more like a real movie.
I would say this is my contribution to Frankenstein. This isn't just, for a podcast, I did something goofy and fun. I really took this as, if I was to make my version of Frankenstein, what would it look like?
Yeah, and it shows,
and I
right?
wanted to imprint that on this.
You are like a gothic and pulp horror writer. That is like one of your main things that you do. Even as a musician, as a songwriter, you are a horror storyteller, and you brought that into this first, not thinking about how do I make a product, right? You are applying your craft. Now, I am also a storyteller, but I'm also a hack.
No.
I mean, we're going to find out. I don't think I've never presented any fiction to you ever.
No, this is going to be the first time.
It's kind of cool because it means I've read you, right? And I've been to very many of your shows, and I love your music.
Thank you.
You've heard my music, but it has almost nothing to do with the sensibilities of my fiction.
Right.
Nor does my criticism is also kind of snarky, and so it's my writing. But it's going to be really interesting to see, as this podcast goes through, how we respond to each other's work, how we maybe influence each other's work, and how we have to feed into the kinds of themes and the kind of stories that we're each interested in telling.
And I do want to say, for the people listening, if you do find yourself listening to this in the next episode and going, oh, I'm more of a Dalton person, or I'm a Dylan person, please don't tell us.
Don't tell us. We don't want to know.
Don't tell us.
Just say those two are great. We love the stories they tell together and their delightful rapport that they have.
Yes. Do not tell us which one of us you prefer.
Keep it in the group chats, okay? Don't let us find out.
We have gone long already on our second episode, just by a tad. I'm actually impressed that we were able to keep it as we were with such a big pitch to talk about.
Yeah, if we do this well in the next one, I'll be also very impressed.
Yes. So thank you, everyone, for listening. That was episode 2. We're going to lock it in. This is our Frankenstein. We're closing the book for now. We can always, go back pending studio notes, but we are...
Oh, I don't know, man. I don't know if we should be allowed to change anything.
Let's lock it in then. Frankenstein is locked in. The cast, the director... We're closing the vault on that one, and we are moving forward
with the
Dark Universe.
Yes.
Next episode, meet us back here in 2 weeks. We are going to have the third film in the Dark Universe, The Wolfman by Dylan Roth. All right. Thanks, everyone. Are you afraid of the Dark Universe?
We're still working on it.
Yeah.